For over a century, we were told a simple story. Japan is Japan, Korea is Korea. Two separate peoples with two separate bloodlines divided by a narrow strip of sea, but buried in ancient bones, bones pulled from burial mounds, shell middens, and forgotten tombs. Scientists have found something that shatters that story completely. It turns out the neat, tidy version of history we grew up with, the one where each nation has its own pure, unbroken bloodline stretching back into the mists of time, was never true to begin with. What ancient DNA has revealed instead is a story of repeated waves of migration, of populations blending and splitting and blending again, of ancestors crossing the sea between the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago, not once, but over and over, across thousands of years. And the implications of this research go far beyond academic curiosity. They touch on national identity, on ancient rivalries, on the way two modern countries understand who they are and where they came from. So let's dig into what the science actually says, because the real story is stranger, messier, and far more fascinating than the myths. To understand why this discovery matters so much, you first need to understand the story that came before it. For most of the 20th century, the accepted narrative of Japanese origins rested on what's called the dual structure model. According to this model, Japan's population descended from two main ancestral groups. The first were the Jomon people, hunter-gatherers who lived in the Japanese archipelago for more than 10,000 years, developing one of the world's oldest pottery traditions and living in relative isolation, cut off from the Asian mainland by the surrounding seas. The second group were the Yayoi, rice-farming migrants who began arriving from the Korean Peninsula and continental Asia around 3,000 years ago, bringing with them wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron tools, and an entirely new way of life. According to the old model, these two populations mixed together over centuries, and that blend of Jomon and Yayoi ancestry became the genetic foundation of the modern Japanese people. It was a clean story, 2 ingredients, 1 final product. And for decades, it was treated as settled science. The Jomon themselves are one of the most remarkable prehistoric cultures in the world. They lived in the Japanese archipelago for more than 10,000 years without adopting large-scale agriculture, instead sustaining fairly complex, semi-sedentary communities through fishing, hunting, and the gathering of nuts and wild plants. They produced some of the oldest known pottery on the planet, intricately decorated with cord-marked patterns, which is actually where the name Jomon comes from, since it translates roughly to cord pattern. For thousands of years, this population appears to have remained relatively isolated, developing a genetic signature distinct from mainland Asian populations. Then, starting around 3,000 years ago, everything changed. Waves of Yayoi migrants began arriving from the Korean Peninsula, bringing wet rice, paddy agriculture, metalworking, and new burial customs. And over the following centuries, these newcomers gradually spread across the archipelago, mixing with existing Jomon communities as they went. By the time the Yayoi period gave way to the Kofun period, marked by the construction of enormous keyhole-shaped burial mounds for powerful rulers, Japan had already been transformed by centuries of migration, agriculture, and social change. This was the version of events that stood largely unchallenged for most of the 20th century. Korea, meanwhile, had its own founding narrative, one built around the idea of a single, continuous, remarkably pure ethnic lineage, tracing back to ancient tribal confederations on the peninsula, largely undisturbed by outside influence. This idea of ethnic homogeneity became deeply woven into modern Korean national identity, reinforced through education, through public memory, and through decades of political emphasis on cultural continuity. Both countries, in other words, built modern identities on origin stories that emphasized separateness. Japan had its 2-part blend, isolated from the mainland by the sea. Korea had its singular, unbroken bloodline. Neither story left much room for the idea that the two populations were, in fact, deeply entangled with one another again and again across thousands of years of prehistory. Then came ancient DNA. Over the last 15 years, the field of paleogenomics has transformed how we understand human history. Rather than relying only on pottery styles, tool types, and skeletal measurements, the way archaeologists once had to, scientists can now extract genetic material directly from the bones and teeth of people who died thousands of years ago. It is painstaking work. DNA degrades over time, breaking apart into shorter and shorter fragments the older a sample gets, and ancient samples are often contaminated with modern bacteria, fungal growth, or handled by researchers whose own DNA can bleed into a sample during excavation or storage. The petrous bone, a dense structure at the base of the skull, and the roots of teeth have become the preferred sources for extraction, because their density helps protect the genetic material trapped inside from centuries of decay. Even with the right source material, researchers still need to work in sterile, positive pressure clean rooms, wearing full protective suits, precisely to avoid contaminating a thousands of years old sample with their own modern DNA. But improvements in sequencing technology, along with these meticulous clean room extraction techniques, have made it possible to recover surprisingly complete genomes from remains that are thousands of years old, sometimes from samples no larger than a few grams of bone. And when scientists apply these techniques to burial sites across Japan and Korea, comparing ancient genomes against thousands of modern reference samples, the picture that emerges is far more complicated and far more interesting than the old two-population story ever allowed. The first major crack in the traditional model came from a landmark study published in Science Advances, in which researchers sequenced ancient genomes recovered from sites across the Japanese archipelago, spanning thousands of years of history. They analyzed the DNA of Jomon period individuals from 4 distinct phases of that culture, and they also sequenced individuals from the later Kofun period, the era of massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds and the emergence of centralized political power in Japan. What they found upended the simple 2 ancestry model almost entirely. Instead of the population forming from just 2 waves, Jomon hunter-gatherers followed by Yayoi farmers, the genetic data pointed to a 3rd, distinct wave of migration arriving during the Kofun period itself, centuries after the Yayoi migrations had already occurred. This meant that modern Japanese ancestry wasn't a simple 2-ingredient blend at all. It was a layered 3-part structure, Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun, each contributing a different genetic signature, each arriving at a different point in time and each leaving a distinguishable trace inside the DNA of people living in Japan today. This finding alone was significant, but it raised an obvious question. If there was a 3rd wave of ancestry arriving during the Kofun period, where exactly did it come from? To answer that, researchers needed more ancient genomes. And specifically, they needed genomes from individuals who lived during the transition between the Yayoi and Kofun periods, the very moment when this mysterious 3rd ancestral component seems to have entered the archipelago. That is where a study led by Jong-Yun Kim and Juno Hashi at the University of Tokyo became so important. Their team recovered and sequenced the complete genome of an individual from the Yayoi period, excavated from the Doigahama site in Yamaguchi Prefecture, one of the most significant Yayoi burial grounds ever discovered in Japan. When they compared this ancient genome against a wide range of modern populations across Asia, the results were striking. Among all the non-Japanese populations tested, this ancient Yayoi individual's DNA showed the closest similarity to modern Korean populations, not Chinese populations, not populations from Siberia or Mongolia or Southeast Asia, Korean populations specifically. This gave direct genetic support to something archaeologists had long suspected based on artifacts and burial customs, that the primary source of migration into Japan during both the Yayoi and Kofun periods traced back to the Korean Peninsula. But the study did more than confirm a Korean connection. It also directly challenged an existing theory, known as the 3-way admixture model, which proposed that the Yayoi and Kofun migrations came from 2 genetically distinct source populations, a Northeast Asian group arriving during the Yayoi period, and a separate East Asian group arriving later, during the Kofun period. Ohashi and his colleagues argued that this specific version of the 3-way model didn't hold up. Instead, their genetic evidence suggested that the primary migratory source for both the Yayoi and Kofun waves was the same broad population, one rooted in the Korean Peninsula, even though the 2 migrations happened centuries apart and contributed different proportions of ancestry to the final Japanese gene pool. In other words, the number of ancestral waves may have been debated, but the geographic origin of much of that ancestry increasingly pointed in one direction across the Korea Strait. If that were the end of the story, it would already be a fairly dramatic revision of Japanese population history. But in the spring of 2026, an even larger and more detailed study pushed the picture further still. Researchers at the Riken Center for Integrative Medical Sciences, led by Xiaoxi Liu, sequenced the full genomes of more than 3,000 individuals from across Japan, drawing samples from 7 distinct geographic regions, including the main islands and Okinawa. This project, known as JEWEL, wasn't working directly with ancient skeletal remains the way the earlier studies had. Instead, it used rare genetic variants found in living people today, variants that tend to preserve a record of relatively recent population history, to reconstruct the deeper ancestral structure of the Japanese population with far greater resolution than had ever been achieved before. What the JEWEL project found was remarkable. Rather than a single uniform genetic blend spread evenly across the country, the data revealed clear regional differences rooted in ancient migration patterns. Western Japanese populations showed their closest genetic ties to Han Chinese populations. Northeastern Japanese populations, meanwhile, showed stronger genetic connections to ancient Korean populations from the Three Kingdoms period, as well as to the Jomon, Japan's earliest known inhabitants. This wasn't a minor statistical footnote. It amounted to strong support for what researchers are now calling a tripartite origins model, a framework that goes beyond even the earlier 3-wave theory by showing that the ancestral contributions weren't evenly distributed across Japan at all, but instead varied by region, creating distinct genetic subpopulations that still persist within the country today. And the implications of this discovery reached well beyond ancestry charts and population maps. The Jewel researchers also used their dataset to explore modern disease patterns, and what they found connected these ancient migrations to present-day medicine in an unexpected way. 2 hereditary mutations linked to breast cancer, known as BRCA1 and BRCA2, showed strikingly different geographic distributions across Japan, distributions that lined up almost perfectly with the ancestral divide the genetic data had uncovered. The BRCA1 mutation appeared predominantly in individuals with northeastern ancestry, the population more closely tied to ancient Korean and Jomon lineages. The BRCA2 mutation, meanwhile, was concentrated among individuals with Western ancestry, tied more closely to Han Chinese lineage. In other words, migrations that occurred thousands of years ago left a genetic fingerprint that is still shaping cancer risk patterns among Japanese families today. Ancient history, it turns out, isn't locked away in the past. It's written directly into the DNA of people living right now, influencing their health in ways no one fully understood until this research came along. Now, let's turn to the Korean side of the story because the genetic revolution didn't stop at Japan's shores. For years, the dominant narrative in Korea emphasized a long, uninterrupted, and remarkably homogeneous ethnic lineage. But when researchers began applying the same ancient DNA techniques to burial sites within the Korean Peninsula itself, that narrative started to look far more complicated too. One particularly striking study focused on the Gaya Confederacy, a network of small city-states that flourished on the southern Korean Peninsula during the Three Kingdoms period, roughly 1,700 years ago. Researchers extracted and sequenced genomes from 8 individuals recovered from 2 major archaeological sites in Gimhae, South Korea, including tomb owners, individuals believed to have been human sacrifices, and even a child buried in a shell mound, a type of burial more commonly associated with communities in Southeast Asia. What the researchers found was that these ancient Gaya individuals displayed significantly more genetic diversity than modern Korean populations do today. Some individuals showed closer genetic affinities to ancient Jomon-related populations from the Japanese archipelago, while others aligned more closely with northern Asian ancestries. This diversity existed within a single confederacy, occupying a relatively small geographic area at a single moment in time. Even more striking, the researchers noted that these genetic differences didn't appear to track with social status. Tomb owners, individuals interred with elaborate grave goods signaling wealth and power, showed no clear genetic distinction from individuals believed to have been sacrificed alongside them, or from the child buried in a far humbler shell mound nearby. In other words, ancestry and social hierarchy within Gaya society don't appear to have been linked in any obvious way, at least based on this small sample, which suggests that the region's genetic diversity reflected centuries of ongoing contact and settlement rather than a single elite group with foreign ancestry ruling over a more homogeneous local population. This finding matters enormously because it directly undercuts the idea of a single, pure Korean bloodline stretching back unbroken through history. Instead, the Korean Peninsula appears to have functioned as something closer to a genetic crossroads, a region where northern Asian populations connected to the Liao River region of what is now northeastern China, and populations connected to the ancient inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago all came into contact and intermingled over the course of thousands of years. Later, genomic modeling has reinforced this picture, showing that modern Korean populations can be traced to Bronze Age populations near the Liao River, to ancestry associated with ancient individuals from the Japanese archipelago, and to a population known from the Devil's Gate cave site in far northeastern Asia, near the border of modern Russia and China. Rather than a single point of origin, Korean ancestry, much like Japanese ancestry, appears to be the product of multiple overlapping migrations and blending events stretching across the prehistoric and historic periods alike. What's especially fascinating is how tightly interwoven the Korean and Japanese genetic stories turn out to be, once you actually trace the data. Individuals from the ancient Gaya Confederacy showed a genetic closeness not only to modern Koreans, but also to modern Japanese populations, and to individuals from Japan's Kofun period specifically, the exact era when that mysterious third wave of ancestry was arriving in the Japanese archipelago. This isn't a coincidence. It's strong evidence that during this period, people, ideas, technologies, and genes were moving back and forth across the Korea Strait in both directions, not as a single one-way migration event, but as an ongoing, centuries-long relationship between populations on both sides of the water. This genetic entanglement also connects to a long-running debate among linguists, one that predates the ancient DNA revolution, but which these new findings have brought back into focus. Japanese and Korean are 2 of the most mysterious languages in the world when it comes to their origins. They share certain grammatical similarities, a similar sentence structure, a comparable system of grammatical particles, and yet centuries of scholarship have failed to definitively prove that they descend from a shared linguistic ancestor in the way that, say, French and Spanish clearly descend from Latin. Some linguists have proposed a shared Trans-Eurasian or Altaic-influenced ancestry stretching back thousands of years. Others argue the similarities are the result of extended contact and cultural exchange rather than true common descent. What's notable is that this linguistic puzzle mirrors the genetic one almost perfectly. Just as the DNA shows populations that are related but not identical, populations that mixed repeatedly without fully merging into one, the languages show grammatical kinship without a fully provable common origin. Whether the genetic and linguistic questions will ever be fully reconciled remains an open question in ongoing research, but the parallel is hard to ignore. Two peoples, two languages, both showing deep connection alongside distinct, separate identities. Some researchers have even tried to combine the genetic and linguistic evidence directly, comparing the spread of specific Y chromosome lineages against the historical spread of language families across Northeast Asia, in an effort to figure out whether language and genetics move together or separately. The results have been mixed and genuinely contested within the academic community. In some cases, a shared paternal lineage does appear to track fairly closely with a shared language family, a pattern researchers sometimes call a father-tongue correlation. But Japanese and Korean turn out to be a notable exception to that pattern, showing genetic connections that don't map neatly onto the linguistic ones. This mismatch suggests that language and genes don't always travel together in lockstep. A population can absorb a new language through prolonged contact, trade, or political dominance without that shift being accompanied by a corresponding wave of new genetic ancestry. And the reverse can happen too, new genetic ancestry arriving without necessarily replacing the existing language of a region. Untangling exactly which process happened where and when across the history of the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago remains one of the more difficult open questions in the field. And it's likely to stay that way until even more ancient genomes, ideally paired with more detailed archaeological and linguistic context, become available for comparison. All of this raises an uncomfortable but important question. If the genetic evidence shows that Korean and Japanese populations share so much overlapping ancestry, arriving through repeated waves of migration across thousands of years, why did the popular narratives in both countries insist for so long on stories of separateness and purity? Part of the answer lies in the 20th century itself. Japan's colonial occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945 left deep scars, and in the decades that followed, both nations, in different ways, leaned heavily on narratives of distinct, unbroken ethnic identity as a form of cultural and political self-definition. For Korea, emphasizing an ancient, pure, continuous bloodline became a way of asserting sovereignty and resisting the memory of occupation and forced assimilation. For Japan, the dual structure model isolated Jomon hunter-gatherers, blending with Yayoi farmers, offered a tidy narrative of a uniquely homogeneous island nation, distinct from its continental neighbors. Neither of these stories was necessarily constructed with bad intent, but neither one holds up particularly well against what the ancient bones are now telling us. It's worth remembering, too, that these national narratives didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were shaped by real historical trauma, real political struggles, and real efforts to build cohesive national identities in the aftermath of colonization, war, and rapid modernization. Understanding why these stories took the shape they did doesn't require dismissing the people who believed them, or the very real emotional weight those stories still carry for many families today. It simply means recognizing that a national identity built for political and cultural reasons in the 19th or 20th century doesn't necessarily reflect the far deeper, far messier reality of population history, stretching back thousands of years before those modern nations even existed. Genetics operates on a timescale that has almost nothing to do with the borders and identities we recognize today, and that mismatch is part of what makes this kind of research so genuinely challenging to communicate responsibly. It's worth being careful here, though, because this kind of research can easily be misused. Ancient DNA studies are not and should not be treated as tools for scoring points in modern nationalist arguments. The genetic data doesn't prove that one modern country's people are somehow more closely related to or more entitled to claim ancient historical figures or territories than another. What it actually shows is something more humbling and honestly more human. Populations move, they mix, they diverge again, they come back into contact. This has been true throughout the entire history of our species, on every continent and every era. The Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago, separated by a strait that's narrow enough to have been crossed by boats for thousands of years, were never sealed off from one another the way modern national borders might suggest. People, along with their genes, their languages, their crops, their tools, and their beliefs, moved across that water again and again, shaping both populations in ways that neither pure separation nor simple assimilation can fully capture. So where does that leave the popular idea, the one behind headlines like the one we started with, that ancient DNA proves the Koreans and Japanese are not who we thought? The truth is, both more measured and more remarkable than that headline suggests. Ancient DNA hasn't revealed some hidden secret bloodline or overturned the basic historical relationship between Korea and Japan. What it has done is replace a simplified, two-dimensional origin story with a far richer, three-dimensional one, layered migrations, regional variation, repeated contact across the Korea Strait, and ancestral threads that reach back through the Jomon, the Yayoi, the Gaya Confederacy, and the Kofun period, all the way to Bronze Age populations near the Liao River and hunter-gatherer groups from deep within northern Asia. Neither population is a simple, pure, unbroken lineage. Both are the product of repeated waves of migration and mixture, arriving at different times from different directions, gradually forming the populations we recognize today. None of this means the story is finished. Researchers involved in these projects have been clear that their work is really just a starting point. The team behind the Doigahama Yayoi genome has said their next goal is to sequence more Yayoi individuals from different sites across the archipelago, in order to pin down exactly how the admixture between continental migrants and indigenous Jomon communities unfolded region by region, rather than treating it as a single, uniform event. Similarly, researchers working on Korean paleogenomics have pointed out that far fewer ancient genomes have been recovered and sequenced from the Korean Peninsula compared to Japan, partly due to differences in soil acidity, burial practices, and the sheer number of excavated sites available for sampling. That gap means the emerging picture of ancient Korean population history is still considerably less detailed than the Japanese side of the story, and future excavations, along with improved extraction techniques for degraded material, are expected to fill in many of the missing pieces over the next decade. Every new genome recovered from a burial mound, a shell midden, or a forgotten grave has the potential to reshape the timeline yet again, adding new branches, new migration routes, a new nuance to a family tree that is proving to be far more tangled than anyone initially expected. And this is really the broader lesson that keeps emerging from ancient DNA research all over the world, not just in East Asia. Wherever scientists have applied these techniques, from Europe to the Americas to the Pacific Islands, the same pattern keeps showing up. The clean, simple origin stories that nations tell about themselves rarely survive contact with the genetic evidence. Real human history is messier, more interconnected, and frankly more interesting than any single nation's founding myth ever allowed for. The Japanese archipelago and the Korean Peninsula were never isolated islands of pure ancestry, sealed off from the rest of the world. They were, and in a genetic sense still are, connected chapters of the same broader East Asian story, shaped by the same currents of migration, the same crossings of open water, and the same deep human tendency to move, to mix, and to build new communities out of old ones. The bones don't lie, and increasingly, they're the ones writing this history now, one ancient genome at a time. So the next time you hear someone describe an ancient people as pure, unchanged, or untouched by outside influence, remember the story of the Jomon, the Yayoi, the Kofun, and the Gaya. Remember the Korea Strait, crossed and recrossed for thousands of years by farmers, traders, and settlers whose names we will never know, but whose DNA is still with us. History rarely moves in straight lines, and ancestry almost never fits inside a single tidy box. It moves in currents, in waves, and crossings back and forth across narrow stretches of water, quietly shaping the people we are today, long before any of us were ever asked what nation we belong to.